Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Sandy Carielli about bad bots, a few good bots, and the bot-related scenarios we should include in our threat models. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, we're always looking for great guests, more great guests like Sandy, for all of the Security Weekly shows. Submit your suggestions by completing the form at securityweekly.com/guests. And Mr. Kinsella, there has been news once again. Application security is sticking around, or well, I should say perhaps vulnerabilities are sticking around. Application security, who knows where it's been.
It seems like we haven't quite finished everything, solved everything yet. Maybe this year.
Maybe this year, yeah. Actually, maybe we can end early, maybe around November, take a month off. Let's see. But one of the reasons I don't want to take the entire year off is every once in a while we come across a fun article like hacker from Ars Technica. Hackers can infect network-connected wrenches to install ransomware. This is really just kind of a fun, perhaps more giggles that here is a wrench or a nut runner, to use the technical term of what this is. It's almost a 100-year-old tool, in fact. But this torque wrench basically can be connected to Wi-Fi. Let's connect it to the internet because we haven't done that yet. Exactly. And researchers went and played with it. And as with anything connected, they were able to reverse engineer, pop into it. It is a Linux-based operating system inside this device. And they demonstrated after about two dozen vulns, one of which was a path traversal in the web admin, to be clear. So not all these vulns are on the wrench itself, but they showed how to install ransomware. So somebody had some fun just writing some code to run ransomware on a wrench. So kind of neat.
So to quickly bring our audience up to speed on this, this is a torque wrench. So when you are, if you think about when you're tightening a screw or a bolt, how tight you make that is you're applying torque. So there's a difference between torque and horsepower in cars. Torque is what accelerates you, or tightens a bolt. So if you're working on your car or your house, or the example they gave in one of the articles was if you're tightening connections on an electrical panel, you want those to be tightened to a certain level. And that's called a torque setting, usually done in either pound feet or newton meters, if I'm getting it right. But so this is something that's been around forever. There's a specific type of wrench that you specify on the handle, like this is how tight I need this to be. And then you get those big, strong arms and you start like cranking on it. And when you hit that level of pressure, you hear either a click or a beep, depending on which one of those 100-year devices you have. And as Mike was saying, someone decided, hey, let's put a microprocessor on this because, you can't figure it out by yourself. And I can imagine in a industrial setting, Mike, that might make sense, right? If you ever watch on YouTube, like I do, videos of Porsches being assembled in a factory, or pick your brand of car, they'll have a very specific torque wrench for a very specific bolt on that car that's been set right. So here someone's probably saying, hey, if we have these, we can set these 5 levels and just click it from a button. Maybe that's faster, but Bosch makes great things, but that still, when you connect it to the internet, this should be one of our taglines. But I'm not even going to look in 6 months on this one.
No, and it's fun too, because the two parts of it are just whatever gets connected to the internet and that web interface. So web security is everywhere, and it does not. It seems to be reinventing the bad stuff. I'm starting to get pessimistic. I'm not sure we're going to be done with AppSec by the end of the year, but let's forge ahead. I did throw in another article about a thermostat. And again, this is just more of the IoT still has problems as well. And I think the only thing that stood out to me is not only is this one connected, but it also has a port listener. So port 8899. So I'm sure that's already on all of your default port scanning for all the pen testers out there. But any message that it receives on that port, it's going to redirect straight to the microcontroller, and it's going to follow whatever that message is. So it's basically, there's no type of authentication, no type of authorization. It just, I got a message, I'm going to do what it says. So I think there's a lesson in there. Perhaps for thermostats, these are small IoT devices, but it's sort of like at what point does everything has to be required to have some level of authorization and authentication that we can do that also doesn't involve hard-coded credentials or, a certificate that either doesn't expire, doesn't get leaked, or can be rotated. So I'm not sure that's an easily solvable problem if I try and say we should have this.
Mike, you and all your hopes and dreams. Um,
It's still
I
early in
think
the
I want
year.
to.
I'm trying.
I know. I want to tie this one together with the last one because
Mm-hmm.
my brain keeps going, I want to keep thinking on that. Um, I mean, so we've had smart thermostats for at least a decade. I can't remember when Nest started doing their thing. 15 years. Um, but back on the power tool side, like the Bosch thing, I'm seeing. Let's see, Festool has a new table saw out that I think you can set the height of the blade over Bluetooth. So a bunch of different companies are trying things like, this one. Another way I've seen is either RFID or Bluetooth when you replace like a usable component, a consumable component for the saw to know, or a drill or whatever to know there's a new thing on there. So we're seeing more and more of these smarty type things come into these environments. In the smart house, I see too much of this stuff in my news feed, so I tend to ignore it. But we're getting more and more smart things every day, right? Like there's you can replace your wall switch with a little touch screen, so you can touch
Mm-hmm.
stuff in your house on and off. One out of the last week or two, Samsung and all the big TV companies seems like they're starting to put displays into their smart TVs, so you can control your smart house from the TV. All this stuff keeps going, and we're going to have this theme probably more than just today of it's as we add smarts to these things. I thought this is a really interesting one from the point of view of um, someone had good intentions over there when they did this, but that other, I mean, who thinks about putting a firewall on your thermostat, right? And that's sort of what's going on here. Is it's if you think about it, they have there's two chips. There's a chip for doing the thermostat things, which these guys probably designed and implemented and used, and then they're like, oh, we need Wi-Fi. Let's grab one of those off the shelf instead
Sure.
of adding it into our BOM. And the next thing um, Mike Shima is telnetting into your thermostat and controlling stuff from remotely. And the question is, we've had a pattern going last year where some of the major governments are it sounds wrong. Let's say, well, some governments in the world are starting to come up with standards for IoT security and like what you put on the box. And like now you're going to have to go and look and see is your IoT secure label on your wrench when you buy it. But that's a thing. So hopefully we do start seeing that on all these different devices. But it still comes back to the Nest thermostat, which has been around for 10 years. How do you go back and secure or firewall that? I don't know. Norton 360 for IoT. Come on, guys, advertise with us.
That's true. And for the record, I technically would probably use Netcat instead of Telnet just because it's a more fun tool.
True.
True. But let's go through. There were so many Vulns this week, and there is a theme I do want to pull out of them rather than repeat another Vuln, and here's another Vuln. There's another one called Pixie Veil, and this was 9 Vulns in the EDK2. But this is basically in Linux and Windows land, a open source implementation of UEFI. So basically, we're talking about secure booting again, and the vulnerabilities were through the IPv6 network stack. So speaking of things that are old, like Telnet. IPv6 adoption, when will it be happening in Universal? It's sort of that Linux on the desktop, IPv6 on the network. But reading through the list is integer underflow, buffer overflow several times over, out of bounds reads, and basically just a bunch of different memory safety issues. So it's one of those things. It's like, we're still writing this one is in C and C++. Is there anything on the roadmap to turn this into Rust? Don't know. I would say though, peeking through some of the code, because I often try to look when there's vulnerabilities like this, are the patches interesting? Can they teach us something? The code is well documented, and there's a lot of process behind it. You can tell for sure. But and I think the only thing that comes to mind there, I'd love to know what the burden is and sort of the velocity, perhaps to use an engineering term, of writing this code in order to have that type of documentation for each of the functions, for the commits, the signing, etc. Because I would think, non-trivial, and you need to convince engineers and developers to embrace that approach. So that was my thoughts on trying to find a different aspect of yet another buffer overflow.
Do you think? I don't know. I have to think about it. I wonder how many of the IoT things out there actually support V6. If not, that's going to be another wave coming later this year. Of vulnerabilities, I mean, not IPv6 support. Silly. Yeah, they did a good job on this.
It's a great
Do you have
write-up.
anything to add? Not really. I mean, I guess the question comes down to, for our listeners, besides just reading and looking at this, when do you think about, do you bookmark something like this? Like, I mean, if someone's listening to this, like, okay, you're thinking about doing V6 later this year on your IoT wrench, do you bookmark something like this and come back and look at the code examples of like how it's done wrong and what you can do about it? Or do you just come back and search the Security Weekly archives? Or, I'm trying to think like where would my head be on something like this if I was coding this later? Because I know even if I bookmark something, it sort of gets lost. I'm sure if you go out and Google how to, do this correctly, you're not going to find what you're looking for. You might, but this type of post, I guess where I'm going is this type of post. If I thought I was going to be working on something like this later, I'd want to have a bookmark around and go, oh, that's have I made a mistake like that in my code? I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does, and you're triggering neurons in my brain that is slowly waking up on a Monday morning about an article a year or maybe 2 years ago that was another group of researchers that was looking at the TCP/IP stack that came from a common library reused amongst a ton of IoT devices, and they were pointing out essentially, look, this here's this stack that everybody uses that still has like a ping of death, still has very old, well-known vulnerabilities in it. And John, if you are the one who are building whichever your favorite IoT device of the week is, perhaps dealing with TCP/IP or IPv6 isn't top of mind for you, or you don't care, just pulling that library. But if that library is misparsing, things are going to go wrong.
Yeah. It's interesting because you think about, I'm sorry, I'm just tangenting on this for a second. If you think about, if you're going to put a DMZ in your house for, to prevent whatever, not talking to whatever else, like I was playing with Google Nest before Christmas and I had it over here somewhere. It was just in a DMZ. Nothing else was talking to that in the house. But like, okay, do you start thinking about, and this is for just the few percentage of us who actually think about this type of stuff. Do you create a separate network for your V6 devices versus your V4? Or just like, what if like something does get an update overnight and suddenly starts quacking V6 broadcasts on the network and something else just blows up as a result of it? Hopefully not literally. It's I don't know. It's interesting to think about, like, because it's a feature enhancement, right? It's not a bad thing. No one meant it to be, but next thing you know, you've got a whole different protocol, and not even a protocol, a whole different addressing scheme going on. And Comcast will happily take, I know a lot of the ISPs will happily take your V6 packets. So
yeah, I was going to say Comcast loves, they'll shuffle that all over the place. And I think by default, that's what their customers have. So bear with me, John. There's 2 more articles on Vulns, and then we can perhaps broaden into something different. One is a slew of 28 Vulns against Atlassian. So start updating. There's, once again, this goes into my category of we do need to move to memory safe languages Rust, but that caveat is memory safe languages can still be insecure languages, still have vulns. So, Atlassian, lots of Java in there, still has some RCEs in it. There's also SSRF. So that's more of just my broken record soapbox. Yes, let's move to Rust, move to something like that. But even if everybody did that by the end of the year, John, AppSec is still going to move into 2025, I suspect. So we're going to need more sponsors. We're going to need more time to talk throughout next year too.
We've got job security for at least another 6 or 10 months. Oh, and actually, really quickly, as I'm thinking about it, if anyone's looking to hire AppSec people, our own Akira is looking for gainful employment. So do reach out to her. But on this, it's interesting just sort of looking through the list. So it's not just a single product. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or so. And I know, and this is sort of the good and bad about and we could probably do the same thing with Patch Tuesday with Microsoft. When you've got a suite of, look, I might be saying something positive about Microsoft. If you have a suite of products that you're going to release all the patches at once, this is what it starts to look like. At least they've got a standard language. Now it'd be fun here if we go through this really quickly for 30 seconds. I saw a mention of Jetty in here somewhere. I guess where I'm going is, across their fleet of software offerings, are they mature enough yet that they're using the same updated libraries and JREs, and like, is everything sort of the same across the fleet? Or do you have to have different versions for Confluence versus Bitbucket, or because that's where things really start getting hairy. Um, yeah, it's at least they're transparent about this. It looks like a lot of stuff, but I mean, I'm trying to, always look on the bright side of life here on this happy Monday morning. Um, so yeah, it's interesting. We do. I think in the last year, it'd be interesting to go back and see. Stop saying interesting, John. It'd be interesting. We have talked, I'm guessing, about
Educational.
Atlassian a few times. Yeah. Uh, and that's not always, I mean, in some cases it has been sort of, whoops, that that was bad. But at least they're continuing to sort of publish and put the stuff out there versus, I'm sure a lot of the companies that fly completely were missing on our radar. They're having at least as many issues, or at least as many patches, because these are patches, not known vulnerabilities, at least as far as I know.
Yes, and you highlight a very good thing that I was introducing this as even in the wrench 24 Vulns. Here's
Mm,
28 Vulns. The count is just trivia. It's not the implication that this is terrible because it has one Vuln versus 24 versus 3 dozen.
mm,
And you also set up and this. It also made me think of here's the discussion of transfer of risk. Do we manage our own Atlassian server and suite of products ourselves and have to invest in a team that keeps them up to date, or is this the great model for SaaS? And we just say the risk now is on Atlassian to keep their own systems updated, and we're just going to cross our fingers and perhaps have some double checking on this to make sure they do. But that way, we're just our costs are going to be different. But you also set up, I think, a very helpful segue for me because there was one final suite of vulnerabilities that I wanted to pull out here. Um, uh, in a release from GitLab, sorry, still learning to speak in 2024.
That's a good
Some
one, though.
everybody loves Git, I know. Well, we're going to have to do some trivia sometime about is this a Git command or a horror movie title? But they have a bunch of things that are vulnerabilities. One was a critical account takeover that looking at the payload, which I linked to after reading about it from Risky Business newsletter, one of those dead simple type of payloads. Just put in the a user email, your victim and your attacker email within the same line, within the same parameter names, and lo and behold, on the back end, there's probably some fancy array shenanigans going on. But the reason I highlighted this is the transparency that you mentioned, and Atlassian has been quite transparent about this. There's some transparency here, as well as what I thought was nice, more than just we fixed it, we fixed it, we fixed it. But there is a section called "What security measures do you have in place to prevent such vulns?" And they go through about talking about some tests, about doing more code reviews, doing some root cause analysis. Things like two-factor is present, so that would have mitigated a lot of this attack. But maybe let's turn it on by default for everyone. So I thought
Mm.
this was kind of nice to see as something that is more strategic, something that's more fundamental about we had a problem rather than just fix this one particular vuln. Maybe we're going to get rid of a vuln class. I'm stretching a bit here, but I think one of my desires for this year is to talk about getting rid of vuln classes. And I think this type of approach, this type of transparency is a really nice step towards that type of action.
And I think these questions also are I mean, you could, this probably is a template over there somewhere. Hopefully it is. But I think any of us could take this
Mm.
and, just copy those bold headings into your own, word mangler of choice, and ask these to yourselves every time. Maybe not every time, but probably let's start with every time a vulnerability is found. They're probably useful elsewhere, but like, um, you know, what's the minimum you should have in the report?
Hmm.
But it's not so much about what the minimum is, at least to me right now. It's hey, these are the questions you should be asking, and like being able to be prepared to discuss before someone else asks you. Because I think a lot of times people get caught flat-footed on this. Be like, hey, there was a vulnerability in X, we patched it. Okay, well, did it
Right.
affect us? How did we do something about it? Like, what do you tell the customer? Um, it's interesting going back to something the way you led in there. I'm still using that word, but there was an article came out. I saw it over the weekend. Slack has moved to a cell-based architecture for how they use the cloud, so that if a I'm trying to stay generic on my speak here, but if one of the locations where the cloud provider they're using goes down, it doesn't take out all of Slack. It takes out just that one little, and the other cells keep running. Um, uh, but where this is interesting is the guy who was being interviewed in this or talking about this was saying, when you make a single call into Slack to say like get message or something, as that fans out through their cloud, everything they've got set up, the architecture internally, that could result in like 150 API calls. And that sort of comes back to something like this of like, what seems like it might be something, just a single call on the outside, how that sort of flows down and gets triggered, and like what happens as a result on the backside, and where that vulnerability goes in that particular instance might take a bit of really difficult head scratching and thinking about, okay, what's affected by this, or how far does this go? So as we become more, not just cloud based, but as we go into more of these either Lambdas or serverless, whatever have you, where each little thing is just doing a part of that overall, what's necessary to serve a request, it's worth thinking about how do you respond to this, and how do you have that full picture in mind? That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and that full picture too. That's one of those nightmares of testing as well. Depending on how stateful it is, if you're trying to recreate state around that 150 microservice fan out, that can be a little that can be a little rough. But we've now. So those were I think most of the, nope, there's a Bluetooth keyboard vulnerable to pairing injection attacks. Let's throw in a couple more vulns before we switch real quick at the end to some non-vuln areas.
I think this one came out last week. I saw it in a few different places, and I managed to realize that, all those articles are talking about the same thing, which is sort of fun when that happens. But what I'm sharing with is the actual post from the researcher, along with, I believe his code's in here. Must be in here. Yeah. But so what he's talking about, or it's a POC, but for his ShmooCon talk, so really briefly, Bluetooth keyboards, love them or hate them, Bluetooth in general. I actually switched to Bluetooth keyboards recently, so I'm like, my timing's not great. But so he found, I think, 3 vulnerabilities here. 2 are in overall Bluetooth keyboards, where a lot of, and he's got, I'm not going to walk through the whole thing, but he's got some decent graphics along with a funny haha about how that authentication goes. How do you pair a Bluetooth keyboard to your laptop or server or what have you? Please, not your server. But anyways, we all think about, and if you've ever done this, usually when you pair that keyboard to your laptop, up on your screen pops, type these 6 numbers in, so we know that you're in that's the authentication path. It turns out that part of the Bluetooth spec is there's an ability to get in there without having authentication. You know where this is going. So he's able to create a virtual keyboard and Bluetooth that bad boy into your laptop and start typing when your hands aren't on the keyboard, that type of thing. The second one, which I thought was equally, at least if not more interesting, this is a single CVE 2024-0230 for Apple's Magic Keyboard. For most of Apple's wireless devices, if you want to charge them, you USB plug them into your laptop, right? Get them charged. And it turns out for the keyboards, there's a way to do that initial authentication. So if you don't want to do that, type those 6 numbers in that you see on the screen, you plug that keyboard into your laptop. The ghost of Steve Jobs does this thing, and you've got authentication there. It turns out that, I don't want to say encryption, that token, I'll say, which is used to do to authenticate that keyboard to that laptop, still exists in memory. So there's an ability to plug either USB or Thunderbolt into your laptop and sniff that bad boy out and be able to then turn around and connect another device, even though it's supposed to be secure encrypted, over that. As long as that it works until the laptop, it works until the keyboard is power cycled. But there's an ability to sniff that thing out of there and get someone else in, which I thought that was interesting, right? They're trying to do the right thing. They came up with a decent idea of a security model there, but still remove the key when you're not using it, is today's lesson for our listeners.
Indeed, and it does have some fun images in the article you linked to. So listeners, go check out the show notes. Follow that. John, real quick, we mentioned thermostats are listening on 8899. I think our firewalls are also they have some admin ports listening to the internet as well. Real quick.
I'm sorry, you lost me on my own story. This is on the, I think you're talking about the ActiveMQ one, yeah?
SonicWall, yes.
SonicWall, I'm sorry, God.
Yes.
I'm closing tabs and listening at the same time, and firewall seem like it's way too common of a thing. Man, I can't take a handoff. It's horrible. So yeah, this actually, I think initially came out last year. SonicWall firewalls, a few 100,000 of them, 170,000 of them were shown to be publicly exploitable. The reason I mentioned this here, similar as with the other article, which we'll leave in the show notes, around ActiveMQ, is if you have a web interface with admin privileges, don't expose it to the internet. I mean, I think there's a bit of a theme here going on in some of our stories today around this, but yeah, this is another. I'll say it like that, and let's leave vulnerabilities behind us for one day.
Yeah, and there is it is another classic. They use smprintf, but they misuse the return value, because guess what smprintf does? It does not return always the value of bytes it wrote. But John, I did throw in there a list from Portswigger. They are running a top 10 web hacking techniques of 2023. Now, the nominations just ended yesterday, so we're in the community voting phase. And there is actually a really long list of them. A couple of these we've covered before. There's some OAuth ones, and in fact, probably my favorite ones of the list that I'm going to vote for once we're done with this episode is there's a redirect URI validation falls short. Literally, that's the title. And there's Assault Labs OAuth, which I can forgive that very forced pun, but once again, talking about abusing OAuth to take over millions of accounts. That one I think we did cover on a previous episode, and it's also a nice walkthrough of OAuth itself. So it's both educational as well as informative about hacking techniques. And there's a bunch of DNS on there. There's even some IPv6 in there. There's some PHP, some Python. There's even a reference to MyBB, which, wow, I thought that thing, I did not realize that still existed. But I'm not sure if you've had a chance to go through and figure out what your voting is going to be for this year.
I haven't figured out my voting. I have been going through it. I thought when I first saw the list, I thought it was just 10 that they were listing. And then now I see it's it keeps going, guys. It's, I won't say it's quite as compact as our wrap up of the year in December, but man, they've got a lot of really sort of fun stuff in here. The state of DNS rebinding in 2023. Why does that still exist? A lot of these, I think, for most of us, as we read through this list, it's going to be like, wait, that's still a thing. And yeah, I mean, F5 is in here multiple times. One for NTLM, one for request smuggling. They had one for AWS API gateway around SQL injection, something related to MS SQL. Why are those two in the same sentence? I don't know. Yeah, nothing. Oh, they got another WAF for AWS. Invalid JSON objects, Unicode escape sequences. Anyways. Yeah, it's a fun list. I mean, I think any of these things you could sort of stop and let's just pick one randomly here. Code vulnerabilities put SCIF emails at risk, or I don't even know what that means. Okay, let's pick something else. Anyways, you get the idea, right? You can go through these and there's a bunch of really great stuff in here. So please do go and check it out.
Mostly just going to make some, yeah, there's probably one in there. It's the blue M&M technique where he just made up a couple of acronyms just to see if people are legitimately voting or not.
Yeah.
Real quick, there was, now apologies, John, I pulled an article from Reversing Labs, and I say article when I really mean press release. And when I mean press release, it points to a report that's behind a registration wall, but it's there's two bullets I want to highlight here. It's mostly talking about a significant increase in threats against the PyPy platform, and it's also talking about a drop in number, but how huge that the number of malicious NPM packages are out there, and a lot of the problems that they've seen across PyPy, across NPM, and some others is exposed secrets, basically secrets in these packages. And I, rather than try to make you fill out all your information and submit that to the report, want to talk about GitHub's secret scanning. they do this as well. And they'll actually say, we're going to scan public repos for known secrets. And we're going to say, hey, AWS, by the way, this looks like one of your this pattern matches one of your secrets. Azure, same thing. GCP, same thing. Would love to see in the spirit of killing off a type of vulnerabilities or a class of vulnerabilities. Where's the investment, or how would we make that investment that these platforms, the NPM platform, PyPy, have that same type of secret scanning? So rather than a bunch of different people, a bunch of different researchers looking for these things, we centralize that in the platform. And the platform's just like, hey, we found this. They can even notify Amazon as an example, and AWS can say, yep, that's actually valid. We see that being used in a couple areas that are beyond our risk threshold. We're going to automatically revoke it. So that's my thought for January, to try to encourage this type of secret scanning that GitHub does. And wow, John is making a great face for those of us who listen to the podcast.
Yeah, I just looked at a paragraph in there. Reversing found that secret leaks continue to plague popular applications and hosting platforms such as Slack, AWS, Microsoft's GitHub repository, and Azure Cloud. Okay. And then it says NPM accounted for 77% or 31,000 of more than 40K secrets detected across those 4 open source platforms. Which were the 4 open source platforms? I'm not sure if that's reading fail or writing fail. Oh, no, let's see. NPM, PyPy, Ruby, Gems, and NuGet. That's the 4 they're talking about. 31,000 secrets sounds low. But yeah, I think, unfortunately, listeners, one of the takeaways here is we're going to keep talking about PyPy in 2024. There was another one I passed on posting, Mike, this week of another PyPy one out there, more malware in these things, and it's. I'm glad to see the vendors are doing something with it. Hopefully, the other side will start doing something to secure this stuff as well. And then the other thought I had there, wrapping up real quick, it might be fun in 2024 if any of our listeners have the interest. Every time we cover every article we cover in here, come up with like a pick up open source WAF language or something, and like come up with the rule to like actually block that thing from happening. Then we can have like the ASW WAF package for our listeners to implement or to use.
That'd be very cool. And John, we are running out of time. I wanted to at least just call attention to a link to history of computing, and GCHQ that had celebrating the 80th anniversary of what may have been the world's first digital computer. And this is something for the computing nerds out there. This is potentially even a precursor to ENIAC, if you know that ancient beast. But this was over in Bletchley Park. And so this was something that was also under wraps and a precursor to the bomb of Alan Turing fame. And this was used to crack the Lorentz cipher during World War II. But a bunch of fun, more things that you can read about in that article. I just wanted to expand the scope of what we talk about, a pretty fun use of computing there.
It is fun. Well, I think it wasn't fun to them. I think it was really serious.
That's possibly the right word. Yes,
fun for us. But what's interesting is just looking through it, like there's some great images for those of you who are into this type of older stuff, or not. But think about like this big computer that, like, it's a console with a teletype machine, and like all that probably fits on like a very small corner of what's going on in my iPhone right now. So we've come a long way.
We indeed have. I'm sure there's a JavaScript emulator that could be written up in your browser right now. But that does end, not January, but it does end our news segment, John. I want to say thank you once again for helping me walk through the news and all of the interesting, but also educational, we'll use that word a lot too, articles of the week. Thanks everyone for joining us. Please do subscribe, share on the socials, check out the show notes. And speaking of humans and bots, check out Race Against Time 3.0 from Elevate the Sky. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.